Okay. Okay, lesson 2. The problem of evil is a complex one. It's many faceted and it's all consuming in the Bible, I'm persuaded. It's something, therefore, that shouldn't be taken lightly. And yet, like I said last week, and I'm going to touch on this side of the problem of evil, probably during the beginning of each lesson. We said last week that the Western culture, if you will, naturalistic culture, which is the Western culture, views evil in a way that many other cultures of the third and the second world don't view evil. Those cultures are fully aware that evil exists. You don't have to convince them that there are evil spirits. They're only too aware that they're there, and they do all they can to fend them off. What is good about hearing the gospel in those parts of the world is that when they realize the power that God through Jesus Christ has over that realm, they are so relieved, because they've lived all their time trying to fend off evil, in whatever way they could, through their pagan rituals or whatever it was. But they knew that the best they could do was try to pacify the things that they didn't understand in the spirit world, whether they were animist or whatever form of understanding they had. And so they were constantly in abject fear of this evil that they believed surrounded them. And they're no different to the primitive peoples of the world that coexisted with the people of Genesis. Okay, they all have a similar understanding. It is quite amazing how all of those primitive cultures see the world and the amount of things that they have in common. But there's one major thing that they do not have in common with the Bible, and we'll come to that in a bit. The manner in which you choose to interpret what seems to be gratuitous violence or suffering, the sort that, like I said last week, we witnessed on October the 7th this year in Israel, where terrorists subjected not only men, but women, children, and even infant babies to grotesque physical torture and rape. That depends, how you view that depends completely on your worldview, okay? How you interpret those events. If you attempt to understand October the 7th and that nightmare against a canvas that depicts the cosmos or the universe as meticulously controlled by an all-loving God, then you are left necessarily questioning either the genuineness of God's love or the genuineness of evil, because you can't have it both ways. You have to question, how would God allow that to happen? If he's omnipotent, if he's all-powerful, why wouldn't he step in and stop something of that level of evil? And that's a common thing that people wrestle with in the faith, as well as those who are agnostic or even atheistic. But if you view such suffering and evil through a lens that depicts the world as a real battlefield, ravaged by centuries, if not millennia, of conflict among powerful, invisible forces, then such suffering begins sort of perversely, it begins to make sense. since this is what war looks like. And I think one of the things that not enough of us have lived through, those who grew up or witnessed or fought in the last World War are very few. There's not many left now, okay? But they know what a battlefield looks like. They know what a war-torn country looks like. Those that grew up through the Blitzkrieg of London in the early 40s, the Germans that lived in Dresden during the end of the war, when the day and night bombing raids took place and literally leveled the whole city. You don't have to convince them what a war looks like, okay? War does all kinds of evil. One of the things that's interesting about this generation, or the generations that are viewing the war between Israel and Hamas at the moment, I find, is the constant call for a ceasefire, because they don't understand what a war is. And if you're going to eradicate evil, there is necessarily going to be, what do we call it? Collateral damage. It's the only way in war. War understands that. I don't think the people of today would sanction a world war if they'd been around 70 years ago, 80 years ago, because I don't think their worldview is the same as those people. And I'm not making a point of whether war is right or wrong, okay? I'm just making some observations about a difference in viewpoint today. It seems to be apparent. But how you view evil, if your worldview sees the world as a battlefield, and not just physically speaking, I'm talking about spiritually, that there is a war going on that corresponds in many ways to the physical war, and however the manifestation of evil shows itself or demonstrates itself in the world, then I think you're able to deal with and interpret those kinds of events in a way which makes more sense and is more compatible to the biblical view, okay, of the writers of Old and New Testament, and also the early church, okay, the church as it was pre the Roman Catholic Church getting control of things. So it's my contention, and what I want to show tonight is that the early Old Testament writers understood the world to be inhabited by demons, which in the Old Testament, I'm going to look at those hopefully in next week or the week after. But more than that, not just demons, but the whole world is engulfed by hostile forces that were persistently trying to destroy God's creation. That's what the Old Testament seems to show us. It's necessary, though, at this point, to say something about the belief systems of the ancient primitive cultures of the Near East, those nations that were near to or surrounded Israel, okay, in the biblical Old Testament times. I'm thinking of nations, the Bible calls these places like Mesopotamia, yeah? And Chaldea and Shur and Sumer, all of those nations. In modern day, we'd be looking at Iran, Iraq, Armenia, Turkey, all those areas, okay? But also Canaan, all right, and Egypt. And ancient Greece will come into it as well. Although their creation accounts and early histories have a very mythological bent to them. You know, there's all these supernatural characters, monsters and gods and things that definitely don't look as if they're true, okay? I believe that the central theme of those stories points towards a truth, okay? It points towards a truth, and I'll show you with some examples shortly. And I think there are striking similarities between their accounts of creation and their accounts even of the flood cataclysm, and the ones that we have in the Old Testament. And I'm not persuaded that that's by accident. These primitive peoples all claim to be affected by wars of good versus evil. Okay, and you had two definite distinctive sides, the good and the evil. And they were all being fought by these invisible spiritual powers. When things were going well on the earth, to those peoples, it was an indication that things were going okay in the unseen world as well. Conversely, or on the other hand, if people were suffering with sickness or plague or famine, or just there was a lot of tragedies going on around them, then this must be because evil spirits were clearly getting the upper hand in the spiritual realm as well. That's a fairly consistent viewpoint that seems to be evident throughout all of those cultures. You know, Everett Ferguson, who's emeritus professor of Bible at Abilene Christian University, he's well in his 90s now. He had a book, he did a series of lectures back in the early 80s on demonology. And I got a copy of that book, and his research into the Hebrew Old Testament culture and the ancient cultures of the Near East, okay, and even the Greek, early Greek culture. He found and shows that all of those cultures, including the Hebrews, unquestioningly believed that all evil was the direct result of demonic activity. Even some illnesses, not all, even some illnesses were put down to demonic activity. Okay, and that was a consistent thing through all those cultures. Ferguson also noted that the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians shared a customary view that the world is populated with good and evil spirits that can strongly influence the lives of people for better or for worse. The ancient Greeks believed that demons could either be good or bad. Okay, you know, they could be your guardian, or they could be out to get you, kind of thing. So their use of the word demons is a little bit different to many of the others. But the main difference between the Hebrew culture and all the others is that the Hebrew understanding, the Old Testament understanding of good and evil, was not dualistic. In other words, good and evil, dualism says that good and evil are eternal things. Okay, the Bible doesn't teach that evil is eternal, is from eternity. Okay, it never depicts it that way, and that's really important. Okay, evil came about at a certain juncture in time. Okay, and we'll see why that is as well. Dualism kind of shows things in a different way. It just says that they've always existed, and there's always been this fight going on from eternity. And I don't believe the Bible corresponds that at all in any way. The Old Testament teaches that evil was chosen by created beings. Okay, it was chosen by created beings. That would include who? Us? Just humans? Animals? Angels? Yes, it would, wouldn't it? So they're all created beings, and they had the option to choose to do evil. Okay, and as such, the hostility that evil caused towards all that is good, i.e., God and His creation, is the result of a refusal to continue to love God. Okay, or a refusal to continue to love one's neighbor. That's interesting, isn't it? From the earliest of time, whether that be in the heavenly spiritual realm or the realm of mankind. Okay, Jude talks about the angels that left their position. I can't remember the exact wording. Let me turn there. Jude, was it verse 6, I think? Get there before me, read it. Verse 6. The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. Okay, so that implies to me they made a choice. They were active in that decision. It wasn't done to them. Okay, they chose it. All right.
Is Satan one of those?
I would think so, wouldn't you? Yeah. But he wasn't alone, because that was definitely plural there. The result of the refusal to love God or one's fellow neighbor, whether it's in the spiritual realm or the realm of mankind, is what's caused the problems that we are surrounded by and affected by today. The other striking difference is that we believe our God will win out completely in the end against all evil. And that's referenced in many prophecies of the Bible, whether they're messianic or end times, called eschatological, or both. Prophecy definitely tells us there's only one winner, okay, and that's God. Many of these surrounding cultures also exhibited complex understandings and interactions with spirits, whether they were guardian spirits, whether they were evil demons that could possess people and therefore needed exorcising by the use of potions or incantations or other remedies, and even the amulets that they commonly wore that were fashioned in such a way they believed to fend off demon possession and other evil things that could happen. But the Old Testament has a much more optimistic understanding of God's control over the spirit world, though it does share more of this demon-infested worldview than most of us in the Western world are willing to concede today. And there's some of those things that I want to share over the coming weeks, especially in the Old Testament. Let's have a look quickly at a few myths from the Old Testament, probably ones that are contemporary with the early Old Testament writing. One of the best known myths is the Mesopotamian Babylonian Enuma Elish epic, which is a creation story that probably dates back to Abraham's time, or maybe Job's time. So we're talking in the second millennium BC. So it's pretty early. In the beginning, according to that myth, Apsu and Tiamat lived peacefully in the happy nothingness of the pristine abyss. So I want you to think of Genesis 1 verse 2 right there. Okay. In time, they engendered other gods who made too much noise and irritated them. Apsu decided to kill them, but the younger gods learned of his plan and beat him to the punch. They killed him. Tiamat became enraged about all this and created a vast horde of demons who were as frightful in appearance as they were in character, so that he might exterminate this band of rebels. In response, the rebels elected Marduk, god of Babylon and hero of this myth, to fight Tiamat and her evil cohorts. They engaged in a fierce battle until Marduk finally vanquished Tiamat by sending a violent storm wind into her as she opened her mouth to swallow him. Again, think of Genesis 1:2, where Yahweh's Ruach, which is the Hebrew word translated either wind, spirit, or breath, most versions say hovers over the Tehom, which is the Hebrew word for the deep. Okay, you see the similarity there in the theme I know there's plenty of mythical creatures. The victorious Marduk then carved up this sea monster Tiamat, and he says he did artful works with her. From her body parts, Marduk created the orderly world. He assigned each god to play a role in preserving the order of his creation: the moon, the night, the sun and the stars, etc. He posted guards to keep her waters upon which the earth rests from escaping. Okay, just keep that thought. And he imprisoned and set guards over the demonic followers of Tiamat. Then, out of Kingu, Tiamat's evil advisor, he created human beings for service to the gods. That's essentially the story. There's plenty in there that is obviously mythical, but the general theme is interesting to me. One of the things, question 7 there, that you should notice from this account is the clear conviction that order has got to fight and it's got to overcome chaos. Yeah, do you see that there? Tiamat is one of these chaos monsters, a bit like Leviathan in the Old Testament, as we'll see. We saw there that Tiamat tries to swallow up order, which is represented by that god Marduk. And so she must be slain, and order then imposed upon her. The chaotic waters of her inner being had to be perpetually kept at bay. A concern about the threatening waters that were believed to encompass the earth. And they weren't the only nation who believed that these waters engulfed the earth and that the earth was created and founded on the waters. Because even the Old Testament teaches that, doesn't it? The key difference between the Old Testament and all these other creation epics. Hold on a minute. Just want to make sure I'm in the right place. Yeah. The Enuma Elish story, it's actually a poem, is a story of creation of the universe. But it's also a story about the reality of that universe today. Historical records show that the victory of Marduk was celebrated every New Year's festival in Mesopotamia. Every year. The victory of order over chaos, of fertility over infertility. Or in Egypt, it was a celebration of a helpful Nile River over a Nile River that flooded and caused terrible damage to people and destroyed crops. Each had to be won anew every year in each of those cultures. But it appears in that account of the Enuma Elish, as in all the others, that while no other gods are particularly endearing or particularly morally pleasing in the accounts, none of them became hostile until an act of rebellion occurs in each of those accounts. Okay, each of those accounts seems to have that in common. The origin of evil is always rooted in this act of rebellion. And from a Christian perspective, the reasons for the rebellion, like in that Enuma Elish, might seem a bit trite. People being too noisy, or God's being too noisy. That seems very trite, doesn't it? But there's been a study done, extensive study of 12 different primitive civilizations. And it was confirmed that each one's creation story fit the same plot. A hostile monster threatens creation. A heroic god defeats the monster and releases forces necessary for life. And the god then controls or fashions these life forces to bring about the creation of the world, or at least significantly influence life in this world. And that theme runs through all these stories in the sense that order and good must war against chaos and evil. And the explanation for the imperfect nature of the world and the world's future destiny of being an orderly world is found in just this war that takes place. It's interesting to me that in every one of those stories, the good or the better God always ultimately ends up winning. And that actually reflects a biblical perspective. Why am I talking about all of this? Well, perhaps no other nation had more effect on the Hebrews in the Old Testament than the Canaanites did. One story has Baal, the chief Canaanite god, battling a sea monster called Yam, which literally means sea. He's battling the sea. Yam starts the conflict by taking Baal prisoner as a means of establishing his own lordship. But Baal is able to rise up and vanquish the sea. He then proclaims that the sea is very much dead and Baal rules. In other versions of the story, Yam is represented as Lotan, which is a twisting serpent that travels through the sea, very much like Leviathan of the Old Testament. And I'm persuaded again that although the mythological dressing is there, if you set that aside, the bare bones of the story closely constitutes the very battle that Yahweh, that God, engages in against these evil forces in the Old Testament. Again, the key difference is that the Old Testament creation story shows us and presents to us a God that is almighty and a God that is holy. And he's one. And he's the only face of goodness and righteousness. And that is different to all of these others. But if you were trying to reach out to those people, okay, as would have happened in Israel during those times, those people sojourned, some of those people came and sojourned with you, and you shared some of these stories, do you think that they wouldn't have recognized things straight away in there and said, oh, yeah, we have this, but our gods, they're nothing like your God? Because they would see the power and the holiness of the true God that we call Jehovah, Yahweh. So I think there's a reason why there's such a similarity there. It definitely has a winsomeness to it for those peoples. We can look at examples of how God is described in Psalm 99:9. He's the Holy One. I like personally 1 Samuel 2:2. Do you remember Hannah's prayer? 1 Samuel 2:2, she says, my heart exalts in Jehovah. My strength is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. I really like that. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. That's powerful, isn't it? When you think about the stories of, fighting the evil, fighting these evil forces that are trying to destroy the world. There's no mention of lesser morally compromised gods in our Old Testament. Instead of humanity being made from the dismembered carcass of an evil monster deity, our divinely revealed understanding confirms that humanity is made in whose image? The image of God. And after his likeness is what Genesis 1:26 and 27 says. After his likeness. Like God, we're given dominion of the earth by authority of a covenant with God. Not because God needs help, as the pagan mythologies suggest, but because having this sort of dominion is what makes us, in some ways, like God. Okay? He has dominion, and he wants us to have dominion. Our dominion is of the earth. How tragic, then, that when man sinned, he lost that dominion, amongst other things. He lost dominion of the earth, and instead, who has it now? Who's the ruler of this world? 2 Corinthians 4:4.
Satan.
Satan and his minions. We should also know that the Old Testament is unprecedented in that it emphasizes God's sovereignty over all other gods. In place of the demon-infested paranoia that plagued all these other cultures, like I mentioned earlier, we find the Old Testament shows and gives us a confident assurance that the whole world belongs to God, to Jehovah. And that's not to say that the Hebrews didn't acknowledge that the world was constantly being attacked by hostile forces that are variously described as raging seas that encircle the world, as well as various monsters that wage war upon the earth, like Behemoth, like Leviathan, like Rahab. If you look at the book of Job, we'll see that in a bit. But like all other nations, the Israelites believed that the earth rested upon the waters. Consequently, when the author of Genesis wrote in Genesis 1:2, without any explanation to the surface of the deep, Tehom, and the waters, no ancient Near Eastern person would have had any difficulty understanding what he was speaking about. They knew exactly what was being referenced there. It's us today that seem to have lost that understanding, and I'm persuaded a lot of that is to do with a pretty poor translation of the Hebrew, which has been adopted since the King James Version in 1611 through all, pretty much all versions that have come out since then. And I think if we did better justice to the Hebrew, we could see that slightly differently. The same deep, the same waters upon which everyone believed that the earth had been founded. Just look at Psalm 24. Psalm 24 verses, I think it's 1 and 2. The psalmist says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." It belongs to him, all of it. The world and those who dwell therein, they're all his. For he has founded it upon what?
Seas.
Upon the seas, and he's established it upon the rivers. Okay. Quite plain what they're saying there. Old Testament authors believe that in some sort of primordial, early time, chaotic form, which maybe is what Genesis 1:2 is alluding to, the earth was originally completely engulfed by water, called the deep in our translations. But that Yahweh, God, pushed back the waters to make land visible. And then when the land appeared, he separated the waters that were below, it says, from the waters that were above, in the account in verse 6 through 10. Holding up the latter with the stretched out expanse, which is kind of interesting language as well. I'm going to go to Job 9 and verse 8. I'll read from verse 6. Who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble, its foundations tremble? Job 9, verse 6. Who commands the sun and it doesn't rise? Who seals up the stars? Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? Look at that language there. Look at the verbs he uses. Trampled the waves of the sea. Doesn't sound like the sea's a friend there, does it? Again, that's just one example. And Job, like I said last week, is probably one of the earliest writings in the Old Testament. the world was created under a covenant, kind of a covenant with the universe, if you will. But somehow that was broken. And it seems like the creation itself fell into a state of war. And that, to me, seems to be more the inference of the language of Genesis 1:2. Because Genesis 1 verse 2 could, and probably I could make a very good case, should be more accurately translated, the earth had become, which is a pluperfect, and that's definitely there in the Hebrew. It's not the word was, it's not an imperfect. The earth had become a ruin and a desolation. That's how we could translate that word, that term, without form and void, okay? Which definitely seems to describe a battlefield. And from that, God recreated, okay? I know what verse 1 says, that he created the earth and the heavens. But it seems like something went awry in between time. The earth was without form or void. It was a ruin. It had been ruined, and it was a desolation. And darkness was over the face of the deep, of the waters. And the Spirit of God was, my version says, hovering. Or some versions may have a different word there, sweeping over the face of the waters, which seems to be accurate to the Hebrew. What do we do with that? Look, for instance, at how the psalmist affirms God's sovereignty in Psalm 104, verse 9. Psalm 104, verse 9. He says, you set a boundary that they may not pass. I'll tell you what, I'm going to read from verse 5. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, though, they fled. Now, he's not talking, and I used to think this was talking about the flood in Noah's time, but that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about creation. Yes? That seems to be pretty plain to me. The waters were standing above the mountains, so the earth was utterly covered like it was in the flood. Okay? At your rebuke, though, those waters fled. At the sound of your thunder, they took flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you'd appointed for them. And you set a boundary that they, the waters, may not pass, so that they might never again cover the earth. Interesting. Now, I know he says might never again cover the earth. I'll say something about that and the flood in a moment. You make springs, verse 10, gush forth in the valleys. They flow between the hills. And on it goes, describing the beauty of the creation. But to me, that seems to fit with that Genesis 1:2 translation. Likewise, the writer of Proverbs, over a few pages in Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8, verse 27 through 29. Says, the writer of Proverbs says, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle, and where did he draw the circle? On the face of the deep. On the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above, which the Hebrews called the firmament, because they described it as like a bronze shield around the world. Kind of interesting. As the first astronauts found when they tried to come back into Earth's atmosphere, it's pretty tough getting back in. If you don't get it at a right angle, you're going to burn up. because it's hard. So he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master workman. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man. That seems to me to be a creation account, doesn't it to you? Yeah, there's a number of creation accounts in the Old Testament. That and Psalm 104 are both interesting in the different perspectives they offer to us. Okay, now who was it that was there when the creation was happening? Who is that?
Jesus.
Well, it's wisdom here.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus is the one that God created through, isn't it? But so interesting to me. But obviously, all powerful, it seems. The sea wanted to take on God, but it couldn't. It couldn't even stand up to his blast, the blast of his voice. It scarpered, quick time, which I find really interesting. And again, go back to Psalms 29. Psalms 29. Where are we? Psalms 29, verse 3 and 4. The voice of Jehovah is over the waters. I want you to think about when this is taking place. The God of glory thunders, the Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. And on it goes. It's powerful, isn't it? It's really powerful. In Job 38, still in the wisdom literature, back a bit more. Job 38, when the Lord finally shows up to Job, he said, right, you, answer me this. He says to him I'm going to read from verse 6 to verse 11. He says to Job, right, at the creation, I'm sure you were there, Job, on what were the bases sunk? Or who laid the cornerstone of the earth? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God, the angels shouted for joy, or who shut in the sea with doors? And when it burst out from the womb, that's when he did that. He shut it in. When I made clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Were you there, Job? What's he describing there?
Creation.
His creation again, isn't it? So there's more than just the accounts we have in Genesis and the one in Exodus and Deuteronomy as well. There's more than those. God, all powerful again. In Job 7, I'll probably finish with this. In Job 7, when Job feels like he's in court, it's interesting what he says here. Job 7, verse 11, I'll read from to give you context. He says, therefore, I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Am I the sea? And the word in Hebrew there is that word yam, which is the Canaanite word for the god. And I think that's who Job's referring to, the Canaanite god, the sea, Yam. Am I Yam, or literally a sea monster? Other versions say a dragon, okay, kind of like Leviathan, or the Canaanite version of that as well. Am I the sea or a sea monster that you need to set guard over me? Why is he saying that? Why does he use that as an example? How's he feeling? Is he feeling like God's against him?
Yes.
Yeah, he feels like he's an adversary to God. And I don't know what I've done wrong. Why do you need to treat me like I'm one of these, like the sea that's trying to destroy your creation and flood the earth again, or like this sea monster that's trying to fight with you and destroy your purposes, your dominion. So Job seems to have a clear understanding of the good and the evil fight that's going on. He says, I'm not your enemy, Lord. And God would say later on, no, I know you're not my enemy, Job. The enemy is the one that incited me against you back in chapters 1 and 2. And that was Satan. And we'll talk more about him later. Some would tell us that these passages, all these passages I've just shared from the Old Testament here, from mainly the wisdom literature, some would tell you that they're all merely metaphors. That's all they are. But I'm not persuaded that that's correct at all. Because I think that calling them metaphors totally ignores the context of these passages as it relates to this cosmic war that's going on. And I think the point of these passages is to clearly stress that Yahweh and no other God reigns supreme over all the proud, chaotic seas and waters that exist and that threaten the foundation of the earth. Indeed, unlike Baal or Tiamat or Enki or any of the other Near Eastern heroes who are said to have managed to control chaos for a time, it's Yahweh, it's God's sovereignty is such that he can master these destructive forces. He can hold them at bay just by his mighty voice alone. And that should be a great comfort to us. Unlike the pagan gods, Yahweh doesn't even need a weapon, does he? His voice is more than capable of speaking the world into existence, and also of speaking control over these forces that threaten the world. Merely, as the Hebrew word I think seems to elucidate, with the blast of his voice. Do you remember when Israel was before Mount Sinai? And what happened on the mountain?
They asked God to not speak to them.
Right, but he spoke, didn't he?
To speak to Moses.
And what was the reaction of all the people? In fact, even Moses.
They asked him not
He
to
was
speak to
trembling.
anybody but Moses because they were afraid of him.
I know, they said, you send him up there, will you? Because we're too scared. All God did was exhibit his voice, and not even a blast. And they were scared out of their skins. Okay, and even Moses, the one that would speak face to face with God, he was trembling. He was trembling. What do you think they were really trembling at? What quality of the voice do you think was what they trembled at? It sent Isaiah on his face in Isaiah 6. It sent plenty of others that got to hear God. It sent them on their face as well. It's his holiness. It's his holiness. It doesn't need to be anything more than that. The holiness of God spoken through his voice. I don't really know how else to describe it. If you don't get it, then join the club, because I don't fully get it. But one day, we will hear that voice at the judgment. And hopefully, he'll say, good and faithful servant, enter my rest. But when you hear that voice, what will strike you is his holiness. Yes? I said to Fiona the other night, you know, when Elijah, he destroyed all the prophets of Baal, Ahab's, he's not a problem anymore, but one person that Elijah was scared of was who?
Jezebel.
Jezebel. Yeah, and he ran for his life. Where did he run to?
Some mountain.
He ran to the mountain of God. Probably this mountain, Sinai. Yeah, it's also called Horeb in the Bible. And he had to be strengthened on the way down there by an angel, because it was a long way. And he finally gets to the mouth of the cave, the mountain of God. And what does God say to him?
Why are you hiding?
What are you doing here, Elijah? Why are you here? Elijah says, you know, he thinks he's the only person that loves God left on the whole of the earth. That's why he's there. He thinks he's the only one left. And what did God ask Elijah to do? Stand outside the front of the cave for a minute, will you? He stands out there, and what happens? I forget the right way round. I think first off, it's like a tornado. It's a whirlwind. And was God in the whirlwind?
No.
No. And then there was an earthquake. And was God in the earthquake?
No, it was not.
No. And then there's this silence. Silence. There's this whisper. Was God there?
Yes.
God was in the whisper. God was in the whisper. Was that a comfort to Elijah? And it strengthened him, no end. But what does that say about God? It's not God that's in the raging seas. It's not God that's in these natural disasters. That's not God. God is 1 John 4:8. He's love. Of all his character, that's the main essential ingredient, love. And if you're going to love someone genuinely, it can only be by choice, can't it? That's a choice. It was a choice Elijah made. It was a choice that Ahab refused to make. And the more that Ahab and Jezebel and all of those prophets of Baal chose not to love God, but to love something else, they necessarily hated God. And that hatred became more and more intense the more that they were challenged to love God, to repent and return to God and love him. But it was their free choice. It was their free choice, and they chose not to. And so true love of God is a choice, but God recognizes that opens him up to potential enmity, doesn't it? Because he knows that some won't choose it. And he's okay with that. He's not happy about it because he would rather we all choose to love him. But he knows that love can only be genuine on those terms. And so that kind of sets up a lot of what we're discussing here, okay? Because those that have chosen not to love him necessarily will end up warring with him, okay? And that's what we see in a lot of these events, these pictures. If these and other passages of Scripture do actually portray the struggle and the ongoing hostility of these destructive forces to creation, then it's not surprising to me that when God brings judgment upon all flesh in Genesis 6:13, that he should unleash the fountains from the deep, as well as opening the windows of the heavens, the firmament as it's called in Hebrew, above the earth, to cause a flood that once again covered all the earth. It's like God allowed the sea to have its way for a while. And I find that really interesting, because the language of, and I'll finish with this, if you can give me another couple of minutes. Is that all right? In Genesis 8, what do we read? Genesis 8, verses 1 and 2. God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And what did God do to the flood? He made a wind blow over the whole of the earth. And what did that wind do to the waters? They subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were shut, closed. And the rain from the heavens, my version says, was restrained. I wonder why he used that terminology. It sounds like a struggle, doesn't it? He allowed the sea to have its way for a while. He used it like he used evil emperors and countries to enact his judgment on people like Israel. Yes? But he let the sea do it here. But then when its time was up, when he remembered Noah, he forced him back behind the limits I set, back into the deep, you fountains. And that seems to be the language there. And so God is clearly in control of what the waters of the flood were allowed to do and for how long they were allowed to do it. They appear to have a desire to continue to flood the earth, but are forced to retreat back to their assigned boundaries at God's command. And the bars are again repositioned to hold everything as he determined it. So while we shouldn't take these mythological portrayals of cosmic forces that the biblical authors give us too literally, I am persuaded that they affirm a reality to which those portrayals point. There was, and there still is, something hostile to God at a cosmic, universal level. And at the time the Old Testament was written, there is little in the way of reflection as to why these forces are hostile to God. We don't know a whole lot of why is there this enmity. That isn't explained to us yet, but it will be. It will be. Later, Revelation will address those things. But it should be noted that the reason this all started was because of an act of rebellion. Okay? An act of rebellion. If you've got any questions about that or the mutiny that took place in the heavens, come and see me. And if you want to know more about Genesis 1-2, this book I found really interesting. He studies every place in the Bible that those words that are used in Genesis 1-2 are used and how they're used and the grammar, how it was a pluperfect. He does an absolutely huge study on all of that. And it's laborious to get through, but it proves the point that his translation is good. And why it hasn't been adopted by anyone else is kind of beyond me. I don't understand. But there you go. So